Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening and welcome to Woman. Tonight we're going to discuss the impact of women on our political system. With me is Carol Burris, founder and president of Women's Lobby Incorporated. Carol is on the board of the American Parents Committee, the board of the Women's Campaign Fund, and she is a founder of the National Womens Political Caucus. Also here is Susan Tolchin. Susan is director of the Washington Institute for Women in Politics. She is a political science professor and author. She is co-author of Clout, Woman Power and Politics. Susan is a board member of the Women's Bank of Bethesda, Maryland. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Who is the most powerful woman leader in the world at the moment?
Well, I think it's Indira Gandhi, and I had a very interesting experience last week when Helvi Sepulveda was telling a group of women about a conversation she had had about 5 hours before Isabel Perón was deposed by the junta with Isabel Perón. And these two very powerful women had had a long discussion about the importance for women of making sure that people understand that they are in charge of the country. And Isabel Perón felt that she had never created that feeling, that she had never been able to realign priorities. The military always took a large share of the budget, and that when she went to the media, she was portrayed as foolish, highly emotional, and very unstable. And that if she had it to do over again, that she would throw her enemies in jail because then they would be afraid of her. And that Indira Gandhi had done that. It was a way of women establishing from the first that they intended to seek power in the same way that men have, and that therefore she probably is. An interesting theory, very.
Yeah, that is interesting. What about this country? Is there one woman who really stands out, do you think?
I don't think so. I think we haven't developed the kind of leadership. Strangely enough, there was a Prime Minister of Ceylon, you have Indira Gandhi, and of course, one of the points that we make in Clout is that women are more humanistic in public office than their male counterparts, at least at this point in time. And of course, we do get blamed occasionally for Indira Gandhi, who is increasingly repressive in her own role as Prime Minister. I think one of the outstanding women leaders of the world is Golda Meir, who has suddenly been recalled to office out of her retirement as one of the only public figures in the country that could bring together all of the warring coalitions. We haven't developed that kind of leadership in this country. We have some very outstanding women, but none that have been able to at least match some of their male counterparts. But things are changing.
It seems from what one picks up in the media and what people are talking about, it seems that women are beginning to participate in the political system more than they ever have. Is that true from where you are?
Well, I think in the Congress there are 19 women in the House, one of whom is the chair of a committee. That's Leonore Sullivan of St. Louis, who's the chairperson of Merchant Marines and Fisheries. And no women in the Senate, but there are some good women running for the Senate this year. Gloria Schaefer in Connecticut is one. Patsy Mink is running in Hawaii. And you may have a candidate here in New York, Bella Abzug, for the Senate. But I think women always participated in politics. They always did all the grassroots precinct calling. They always did all the envelope stuffing. The difference, which Susan's book demonstrates very clearly, is that there's beginning to be much more now of an effort for them to rise up through party ranks. And so we have Mary Louise Smith as the chairperson of the Republican Party now. I wonder, however, whether or not the rash of women mayors and women in county councils isn't going to take some time to percolate to the national level, not just because it takes time to move up in politics at all, but because also these women are in their 40s and 50s, which is the time that men are reaching the peak of their political power. And their aspirations are often the county council, whereas men have a more clear idea of life planning in politics, I think, and tend to take their steps a little bit earlier, whereas we've been home watching children at that time of our lives.
I think there are some major changes, too, in society and the culture that are causing these changes, and in the political system. One of the major changes is the whole fight for ERA, and this has gotten women into the state legislatures, where you're really seeing the increased participation. I mean, we have 19 women in Congress now. We had 19 in 1962, so we can't really see any great moves forward in that area.
It's not really a big deal, is it?
No.
No.
But the ERA really got women into the legislatures. For years, the party leaders had said, you know, don't run yet, wait till you're really more prepared, and you have to be a lawyer. And they gave them all kinds of stories, and women believed them. Now they got into the state legislatures and saw some of the kinds of people that were representing them, and they figured they could at least do as well, if not much better. So you're really seeing on a local level, I think you're seeing big jumps. And also, we're also seeing, women are also seeing public life as a realistic career choice, particularly on local and state levels, and they're moving in large numbers on these levels. And I think they don't have the kind of societal disapproval that they used to have in the past. I mean, in the last election, the last congressional election, there was actually a committee. There was a woman running for Congress in the Midwest, and her opponents started a committee, Mothers for the I think it was Cougar Children. In other words, showing that how could this woman possibly run for Congress and leave her children back in the home district. And this, she was royally defeated, but I think attitudes have changed so that this sort of thing would not go unnoticed or would not be acceptable today.
I remember Sissy Farenthold saying about her campaign in Texas that her candidacy was a joke. Mm-hmm. You know, she really felt that people were treating it that way.
Do you know the best quote like that is a quote that Mike Wallace made on CBS the night that Ella Grasso was elected. And he said, using Women's Lobby's voting chart of members of Congress, that both Ella Grasso and Hugh Carey had gotten these ratings from us, and that he was wondering what Ella Grasso really planned to do in terms of child care and so on. However, Ella Grasso has 2 children who are out of college. Hugh Carey, on the other hand, has 12 children, the youngest of whom at that time was 2 years old. And Mike Wallace never mentioned the fact that it might in fact be Governor Carey who was in need of child care services and not Governor Grasso at all.
Well, Pat Schroeder, when she got to Congress, was approached by an older male member of Congress who said, "How can you do this? How can you be a congresswoman and have 2 small children?" And she said, "It's easy. I have a uterus and a brain, and they both work."
Terrific. Score 1 for our side. That's really a great story. What do you think? Do you think there was a single event, 68 convention, 72 convention, that really started things rolling? Or do you think it was the women's movement?
Well, I think there were 3 main factors that turned things around. Now, you know, you had the 19th century had the suffragette movement, women got the vote and kind of sat back after that. But 3 things happened in the late 60s and early 70s that really changed things around. One was what we know as the women's liberation movement, the early consciousness raising. I think we've grown from consciousness raising to political action. Our consciousnesses are raised, now let's do something. What I think was a major factor I mentioned, and beside the second was ERA, the third I think was the 72 convention. And both political parties. Now, for the first time in history, women were represented as delegates. They were no longer in the background doing all the licking and the sticking. They were actually representatives. And this, both the Democratic and the Republican parties increased their women delegate strength from something like 17% in '68 to almost 40%, which was the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party, they went from something like 13% to 33% women. And the first time in history, women tasted power in large numbers. And what happened after this convention was that the women returned home and vowed to run for office themselves. They got a taste of power, and they really weren't willing to go back to low-level roles anymore. And many of the women who were, well, almost radicalized, if you want to use that word, at those conventions, went home to really engage in full-fledged and serious political activity.
From Washington, in working with people who are already elected as a lobbyist, I see it in a slightly different way. I think the real revolution occurred right after the Second World War, when women went to work. A majority of married women now work. 75% of women over 35 work. 60% of women between 18 and 22 work. And we only drop off our participation in the workforce for a very short time. The amount of time that women stay home with young children now is consistently compressing. It's now close to 1 year instead of the 6 years it was in 1960. So you have an enormous change in behavior. And then the women's movement comes along, and it's just sort of an attitudinal follow-up to that. We're going out changing people's minds when their behavior has already altered. And we are, in fact, rather than being very radical or very cutting edge, we are, in fact, sort of a mop-up operation that's quite tame and 10 years after the fact. And that operation then moves with the ERA onto Capitol Hill. And in 1970, we lost the ERA in the Senate on an Ervin amendment 36 to 33 by 3 votes when we had 82 co-sponsors. And I remember many of the women that were involved in NOW and in women's rights groups at that time saying, well, look, this is the time now that we have to re-elect and unelect these people and really punish them for not giving us our amendment when they said that they were co-sponsors. And out of that grew the National Womens Political Caucus, and out of that grew a lot of the delegate selection projects, because it was clear that you also had to have the titular head of the party, either the president or the presidential candidate, be responsive to those kinds of demands, and that there were a lot of other demands, like child care, which Nixon vetoed in '71, like minimum wage legislation for domestics, because 98% of domestics are women, and their average income was less than $2,000 a year for a full 52-week year, that also had very broad support, because women who work at home are very sensitive to what the overall worth of themselves is if they can replace themselves by a domestic for less than $2,000. They know they're doing more than $2,000 worth of work. And I think that created a broad base of support on which a smaller group of women who tended to be both politically active to begin with. And you can never forget that only about 1% of the American population at any time is ever politically active. But activist people tend to be active in many things. And so if I'm in Women's Lobby, I'm also in the caucus, and I'm also in NOW, and then I also will be active in my political party. And it works in reverse. People who were active Democrats who saw that their reps were not being very responsive to their needs, particularly on ER, then said, well, then I just am not going to have any truck with you, buddy. I'll find someone else. And although we're still at the stage where we look to the pipeline of the party to put that person in because they will have party support and are the most electable, the women in South Carolina and Alabama in '74 did a project in which they unelected about 20% of each of those legislators, still couldn't get ERA ratified because they picked the man who was next down on the party list, and he owed, say, 75% of his support to being in that party pipeline, and only 25% to the women who had knocked off his opponent. And that, I think, creates another source in which you have this broad base of support and this group of activists who already have their hands on a lot of knowledge of how the party works, who then start pushing themselves up as candidates and on a local and state level.
What's happening is that women are suddenly realizing the relationship between their own commitment to the movement and the political system.
Now, you say in Clout that women politicians are being very upfront about their allegiance to the women's movement, that they're no longer ducking the feminist issue, identification rather.
Yes, and I don't think for altogether altruistic reasons. I think, fortunately, the women's movement at least is creating the illusion of bringing support for issues, and it's no longer a vote-losing effect, or it's no longer a vote-losing proposition to be upfront on women's issues. Now, I think some of the more controversial women's issues, even the women candidates will steer clear of. But certainly there's a wide range of issues on which women candidates can take a lead. Unfortunately, they're regarded as women's issues. They're really people issues. But at this point in time, it's the women who are taking the lead in these issues, such as child care. Child care should certainly be a male and a female issue. And
were the planks at both party conventions in '72 to the so-called women's issues?
Well, what happened at the '72 convention, at least I think the more visible convention with regard to women's issues, was the Democratic convention. And there was the candidate, George McGovern, had promised women leaders that the party would have a reproductive freedom plank. And when they saw themselves losing the entire Catholic vote of the country, I think they reneged on that promise. They also reneged on a number of other promises which entailed a certain commitment to women's rights, the South Carolina vote, California vote. And as a result, women felt intensely betrayed at that convention, another reason for going home and electing their own constituencies into office. what really happened was, well, they called it a communications breakdown, but I think that as they tasted power, they realized that they had the women all along. The women would follow them. You know, one of the women we have quoted in the book said that they thought, George McGovern thought that the women's groups would follow him to hell and back, and regardless of what he did and what he and his troops did at the convention, it didn't happen that way. Women felt intensely betrayed because they pulled back their support on a lot of different women's issues, thinking, well, you know, you just wait. It's more important to get George McGovern elected president and to bring in all these other groups that might be offended by women's issues. But it really boomeranged because the women's groups were so offended and felt so betrayed, or the women leaders and women's groups at the convention, that in a final act of betrayal, nominated their own candidate, Sissy Farenthold, for vice president. What this did in effect was upset the timing of the convention so much that George McGovern's acceptance speech was given at something like 3 o'clock in the morning, which was primetime TV only in Guam. And this was one of the reasons given for the turnaround in his campaign efforts. I think now the Washington Institute did a survey of the current presidential candidates, the ones who are still in the race. And it's interesting that none of them, maybe they feel scared by the McGovern experience, you know, promising more than they could actually deliver, or more than they felt they could deliver at that convention, or they could deliver to women.
Some of them seem to be not even promising as much as they can realistically deliver.
That's right. I think they're all, even the more liberal of the candidates, are skirting the issue. You know, they all come out and support. They've all supported ERA, except for George Wallace, and I think Reagan is waffling that issue, but he has finally come out, I believe, against ERA. The other candidates support ERA, but waffle on the abortion issue. Ford has come out more or less against abortion. The other candidates have Jackson, in answer to our survey, has stressed his record on women's rights, and not really promised very much for future efforts, except for except for continuing the kinds of efforts which he has started in the past. Udall as well has come out, is probably the most liberal on women's issues, but none of them, it amazes me right now that none of the candidates have really tried to step out in front of the pack. And I think this is one area that they could step out in front of the pack, because I don't think they'd lose votes.
It doesn't mean that they're not taking women seriously.
I think that's part of it. I don't think they're taking women as seriously, even though another survey the Institute did showed that, you know, about 18% of the top positions in the campaigns were held by women. But I don't think they're taking women seriously, and probably women themselves, the women's groups themselves, are not making enough noise about withdrawing support, or not making enough noise attacking them on certain issues. They're not doing that at this point for whatever strategic reasons, I'm not sure, but I think they probably could exercise more of a strike force on some of the candidates, at least to extract some sort of promise of future support.
One difficulty is that there are three kinds of women's issues. One is odd women's issues that will never occur again, like abortion and ERA. Mm-hmm. The other is that there are issues which are perceived as women's issues on which there's a general consensus that women have a special need, like childcare or equal access to credit. But the most important issues for the general electorate, I'm convinced, and the ones that candidates have addressed themselves to the most, are the ones that aren't seen as women's issues. But women are the poorest people in this country. They're poverty prone. They earn 56 cents for every dollar men earn. Women over 65 have an average income of $2,119. 42% of them have an income of $120 a month. So you have all of these poor people, and don't forget, by the year 2000, 20% of the entire U.S. population will be women over 65, and then in point of fact, that group is one that we will all join as well, and we're going to live much longer than men. At every year, more men die than women. So you have all of these people who are AFDC mothers, and you have all of these economic issues. Joblessness hits women at a much higher rate than it does men. Women are much more likely to work seasonal and part-time and part-year work. kinds of work that disappear when service-oriented services disappear as inflation rises. And women tend to be in service-oriented industries, so that all of the economic issues, and this is particularly true of people like Jackson, say, or Udall, who have been on Capitol Hill, are also places where they address themselves to women's issues, and women have held them to that, I think, a little bit more. On both abortion and ERA, you have nominal compliance with the Supreme Court decision with some caveats, and some nominal compliance with the idea of ERA, although it's important to note that Jackson gives his support on ERA, the only thing he does unequivocally, and didn't vote for it in '72. He wasn't there, didn't vote, and when I talked to him and to his staff about it, they went and back in microfilmed records and discovered he voted for it in '52, when of course it didn't pass.
Do you think, Carol, there's going to be some effort by the conservatives of both parties to remove the ERA plank from the platforms and to try to submerge the abortion issue?
I think submerging the abortion issue, I think the ERA thing will be just slightly fringy. Don't you think that you would have to get some overwhelming majority for Reagan and do something like that to attack that? Because Mary Louise Smith really built her reputation in Iowa on what she and Roxanne Conlon, who's the Democratic Secretary of State, did to Attorney General, did to get that ratified. I think the abortion issue is another one. A good point for all candidates to notice is that in a recent Catholic survey, less than 12%, it's really 11.9%, of Catholics who are practicing Catholics who attend church regularly said that they would make that an issue in voting for a candidate. And the woman who's running as solely a pro-abortion candidate is getting 1, 2, 4% of the vote, 4% in Massachusetts, which is like a 70% Catholic electorate.
Well, would you say that women are generally not well informed enough? I mean, do you think,
absolutely.
I mean, I really am, I feel that I'm not as well as I would like to be, and I think probably most women are, but what can you do about it?
Well, the problem is
we don't have access to the information that you two have. There seems to be no place where the information is coming.
And women's news, unfortunately, is still on the women's pages of newspapers for the most part, and I think that's probably one of the problems. I think you have to inform men as well as women on women's issues. And although women are going to be that determined minority that's going to push the issue over, I think that there are some very sympathetic men in decision-making powers and decision-making posts or positions that have to be as well informed as we do.
But it's far better to address yourself to really informing women, particularly about economic issues, because women make up to 60% of the primary voters, and they make up the majority of the voters in every election. They make up the majority of the population, and they tend to be active in the party in much greater numbers than men, so that you really have a pyramid that just has some men as frosting on the top. It's just a question of realizing what's been done to you to throw them off, and realizing how broad is the base of support for the kind of reforms that we're really talking about. Very simple things, you know. Child care is simply a matter of paying federal tax money to replace women who have already voted with their feet to go out and work. And the Congress, because they're all men, find it very hard to put up money to do something women have been doing for free. Simple issue to most women.
What if you had to list the issues that women should look for, things they should look for in the party platforms, what would you list?
Social Security reform, tax reform, the kinds of problems that women on welfare have, because women on welfare are women left by men to take care of children. And we're paying them to take care of children, and we're telling them that that's exactly what we think they're worth, is that average $216 a month. And then I'd really talk about the problems of the Humphrey Hawkins bill and how we're going to employ women and employ them at some living wage, like $5 an hour, not like $2 an hour, and employ them to go ahead and do jobs that they're either doing, like service-oriented jobs, but at a living wage, or jobs that they could easily do, like bulldozer operator and crane operator, the kinds of things that we haven't done that are the way to either drop out of high school or get out of high school and earn a very, very good, very decent, steady living all your life.
Sue, who are some of the women to watch in the conventions in both parties? Is there anyone in particular who will be close to the center of action and who will be helping decide some of these things?
Well, I think before, I just wanted to mention something that pertains to what you were saying. I think women have to be reconditioned on issues. In other words, many women tune off politics, feel that politics is immoral, politics is
it's like money.
It's like money. They really don't want to have any. They don't
go.
really want to have any part of it. They don't want to run for office. They can't take the ego knocks that you have to take and getting up in front of a group and speaking your mind and getting attacked in the newspaper, getting attacked on television. They have to be reconditioned that if they don't, that politics is really means their well-being. Unfortunately, there are other women's groups that have organized very effectively against women's issues, headed by women. Especially, we see this especially visibly in ERA. And this is really what has caused the defeats of the state ERA amendments in New York and New Jersey. Women's groups, basically, that have organized and thrown scare tactics into women and male voters. And
how are we going to do that turnaround, though? How are we going to accomplish that?
I don't know. I think that we have to. I think it's something that women leaders have been. Well, they have been grappling with it. It is a massive kind of voter education program that many groups have already begun to do and have done very effectively. But it's also women have not been identified with Watergate. They may at this point in time they make wonderful candidates because they haven't been identified with the practices of the past. Women politicians who come to office usually have to scrape together their own campaigns and run with their own machines, develop their own organizations, and somehow get elected to office. They win the nomination, so they re-enter the party in a sense, but they come to office unobligated, or at least less obligated than male politicians. So I think that this is, this is it's a problem that we have to deal with. And then I'm sorry I didn't answer your question, but I'll get back to that in a second.
I think that it's really not that hard, because I think they're already in control of the party apparatus. The problem is to see yourself as worth it. You first of all have to vote against a man who's bad on women because he is bad on women. We're the majority. If he's not good on us, he's good for a small minority of white men, and they're less than a third of the population, and we can dispense with him because he's not
So are you
representing
saying
us.
women really have a certain amount of power and they just have to take it?
And they just have to take it.
We're out of time. I'm very sorry. Thank you both very much for coming. Thank you for watching, and good night.
Woman was produced by WNED-TV, which is solely responsible for its content, and was funded by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.